The Sunset Strip curfew riots were caused by a conflict of interest between adults and youths and was driven by the rising activist mentality amongst youth in the 60s. The Sunset Strip is a 1.6-mile-long road down the center of West Hollywood, known for its nightlife, shows, music, and pop culture. In the 60s, it was considered the center of youth counterculture because of the prevalent music scene that dominated the popular clubs on the Strip. These famous locations include Whiskey A Go-Go, the club that invented go-go dancers and had the Doors as their house band, the Playboy Club, opened by Hugh Hefner, Pandora's Box, an alcohol-free club that played a huge factor in the riots, the Rainbow Bar and Grill, frequently visited by Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Roman Polanski, and the Roxy, home to the Rocky Horror Show. Some of these will become more important later in the video as key players in the Sunset Strip curfew riots, but first, we must examine the background that provided a backdrop to the riots. At the end of the 1950s and all throughout the 60s, there was a worldwide spread of counterculture that started in Germany. America's youth experienced post-war affluence and became the wealthiest generation on average. Because of this, they were able to concern themselves with more social activism regarding free speech, the right to assemble, and were economically able to be anti-establishment. It was also a time of rapid change through events like the Civil Rights Act that diffused and pushed the idea of protesting for rights youth in general believed they had. The diversity of LA had especially forced every resident to stop and reflect on the question of human rights and justice because of its long-standing racial tensions and history of movements. This was also the time television was gaining popularity, which broadcasted the violent reality of the Vietnam War and protests like the Selma to Montgomery marches. Combined with the continued popularity of film, especially felt in LA due to the location of Hollywood and the existing hippie culture there, and the loosening of the Hays Code, media informed youths, and film spread similar ideologies that catered to a younger audience. There was a disconnect between how television and radio portrayed news and how the more traditional newspapers did. One catered to a youth audience, while the other caters to adults. In a time of change, youths embraced it, whilst older generations rejected it, creating a widening generation gap, as seen through the difference of what is known as New and Old Hollywood. The words of many activists at that time became slogans for the counterculture movement. One of those was, quote, "We have a saying in the movement that we don't trust anybody over 30, end quote, said Jack Weinberg, a leader of the free speech movement at the University of California, Berkeley. The quote was later adapted to be, quote, "Don't trust anyone over 30, end quote, showing the divide in ideologies between generations. The Sunset Strip became a battleground of all sorts of conflicts of interests. Michael Rumans, founder of the Sloths, described the habit of youths on the strips as that they were, quote, "walking down the street, sitting on bus benches, just hanging out. The merchants said it was bad for business, we were scaring customers away, and they influenced the sheriff's department to start cracking down," end quote. Articles started to emerge on the LA Times with headlines like, quote, "Hippies blamed for the decline on Sunset Strip." Businesses on the Strip blamed teens for scaring away customers and for late-night traffic congestion. Consequently, businesses pushed the city council to pass an ordinance that banned loitering and established a 10 p.m. curfew. Hippies were arrested for loitering, and the curfew was nothing less than an infringement of their civil liberties and right to gather in public. Tensions rose further around the question, who is in command of public space? Whose interest does the city and police protect? The song by Buffalo Springfield, "For What It's Worth," written by Stephen Stills, expressed his frustration in the lyrics of that song that go, "There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everyone's wrong. Youth people speaking their minds, getting so much resistance from behind." Youths took the curfew and the ban as the police siding with businesses and adult interests without regarding to the liberties youth believed they had. In response, on November 12, 1966, Fifth Estate Coffee House, a shop down the street from Pandora's Box, printed and passed out flyers written by teenagers that read, quote, "Protest police mistreatment of youth on Sunset Boulevard. No more shackling of 14 and 15-year-olds, end quote. It was a call for a peaceful protest against police mistreatment of youth. The event reached a wider audience through local radio stations, and demonstrators flooded in front of Pandora's Box, carrying signs that read, quote, "Cops uncouth to youth," and quote, "Give back our streets." During the protest, a Los Angeles city bus was trying to pass through the streets and was enveloped by demonstrators. Passengers on the bus fled whilst youths pushed their way in and on top of the bus. What happened after was widely debated. Reports range from accounts of the bus being set on fire to people setting off fire extinguishers on the bus without an actual fire. After the incident, 155 Los Angeles Police Department officers and 79 sheriff's deputies moved in with tear gas and batons, turning what had been a relatively peaceful gathering into something far uglier. Ordered to disperse, the crowd responded by hurling rocks and bottles at the police, smashing windows and overturning vehicles. For the next week, reports of the event headlined the LA Times. The article's titles included, quote, "Long Time No Peace on Famed Sunset Strip," and, quote, "New Year's celebrations end in Sunset Strip rioting." The media's representation of the demonstration as riots further enraged the people involved. For example, Bird's manager and Elektra record producer Jim Dixon was dissatisfied with the representation of the demonstrations as riots.
There haven't really been riots since I was there. They've been demonstrations.
He teamed up with the Beatles and Beach Boys press officer Derek Taylor, and with support from Woolworth supermarket heir Lance Reventlow and Gilligan's Island actor Jim Denver, they formed the Community Action for Facts and Freedom, which attempted to help those affected by police intervention through organizations like benefit concert to raise bail money for those arrested and helping to pay for damaged property. In response, the city council withdrew licenses from clubs, forcing many to shut down. They also acquired Pandora's Box. Newspaper articles continued to report the events that winter, like the Los Angeles Chronicle. Stephen Stills dismissed the dramatic reporting by saying, "Riot is a ridiculous name. It was a funeral for Pandora's Box, but it looked like a revolution. As many as 2,000 people gathered to support and mourn, disrupting traffic for blocks." The impressive number of teens that responded to the closing of Pandora's Box was not only an attempt to rebel against authority, but also shows the value of music and entertainment to teens in Los Angeles. The club was alcohol-free and was home to many popular bands at the time. Thus, closing the club also takes away the music they enjoyed, which teens strongly objected to. The location also allowed celebrities to join in on gatherings on the Strip and to write music in tribute to the events on Sunset Strip, further catalyzing the support from youth. After the bulldozing of the club, New York Times reported that baton-swinging armed officers marched shoulder to shoulder down Sunset Boulevard, shoving the protesters into side streets or clubbing them to the pavement. The protesters described the police as, quote, "blue fascism," and chanted, "Who do the cops protect? The moneymakers." The Los Angeles Police Department was unable to anticipate such a response to the protests and was not able to deal with the situation peacefully, further showing the generational disconnect and the police's inability to deal with public uprisings in general. This would later become a theme for the LAPD as they struggled to find their footing in the rapidly changing political and social landscape of Los Angeles. The Sunset Strip riots reflected America as a whole, but it could also be used as a looking glass into specific LA culture. The city was able to become prosperous through the film and music industry, and thus Hollywood had a strong influence on teens. The clubs that were forced to close in Los Angeles were home to some of the greatest bands at the time. Their frustration manifested in their music that teens supported and identified with. Hence, the backlash from the teen community was made even stronger. What came out of the Sunset Strip curfew riots was a further feeling of youth alienation and a more determined mentality for what the youth believes to be social justice. This manifested in the music scene, especially from the bands that got their start on the Strip. Dominic Prior, writer of Riot on Sunset Strip, Rock and Roll's Last Stand in Hollywood, said, quote, "What made it feel more important to me was that it was the period when music became a lot more socially conscious," end quote, which is able to further fuel teens and adults who listen to the music to reflect and speak up about social issues. The events on the Sunset Strip was just a preview of the further counterculture and rebellious mentality of youth in the 60s. Bob Gibson, manager of the Byrds and the Mamas and the Papas, said that if you had to put your finger on an event that was a barometer of the tide turning, it would probably be the Sunset Strip riots. The reason he saw the Sunset Strip riots as a barometer of the tide turning is because the riots were an indication to youths that the police and adults do not care for their interests. This pushed them to further take their liberties into their own hands and take more interest in social activism in pursuit of social justice for themselves. Like Stephen Stills saying, "Stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down." alluding to the era of youth rebellion that manifested all throughout the 60s in Los Angeles.